Good evening and thank you for joining me this Monday. We bring you a Tjps special report tonight on an escalation between Ukraine and Russia. Yesterday, we reported here on the show that an invasion loomed large, with President Biden saying that he believes Putin's made the decision. The president then backs that up, indicating it's from U.S. intelligence on the matter. Biden says the door to diplomacy remains open, and as of last night and up to this morning, that was true. Last night, President Biden agreed in principle to meet Putin in France if Russia does not invade Ukraine, a big if that the world has been watching as Russia's essentially keeps planning its moves here. So we kept that in mind throughout the day, and then if you were still up, you saw this news last night, NBC News reporting that Russia plans to target dissidents in Ukraine to be killed or sent to camps, according to the United States. According to this article, those most at risk for human rights atrocities after Russia invades Ukraine are political activists, religious and ethnic minorities, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. NBC News has obtained the letter, which reads, quote, "We have credible information that indicates Russian forces are creating a list of identified Ukrainians to be killed or sent to camps following a military occupation." End quote. The United States has informed the United Nations on this urgent matter, as Russia is calling this absolute fiction. Over the weekend, Russia conducted nuclear drills along with its close ally Belarus, which is north to Ukraine. They were supposed to leave Belarus, but they decided to extend their stay, raising speculation of an additional military buildup near the Ukrainian border. Earlier today, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed an order recognizing two separatist regions in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent republics. Now, yesterday we talked about the history of how those became separatist regions in Ukraine in the first place. It was in April of 2014, just a month after Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea, that Russian separatists in Ukraine seized two cities, Luhansk and Donetsk, illegally declaring them both independent from the nation of Ukraine. Now, when the Ukrainian military sought to take those two regions rightfully back, they were met with violence, supported by the Russian government, assisting those separatists. And it wasn't until today that the Russian government formally acknowledged those two regions, officially backing those separatists. And just moments ago, Putin ordered Russian troops to invade eastern Ukraine, where those separatists are. Despite this being seen as a major escalation, even an invasion of Ukraine, Putin is calling this a peacekeeping effort, a quote-unquote peacekeeping effort, as Russia continues to claim there is a genocide happening in those two regions. That is 100% false, but this is what we've been preparing for. U.S. intelligence repeatedly declassifying reports that Russia would create a false pretext to invade Ukraine. And we are now watching that live. And so what does this mean? Why does Putin even want to invade Ukraine? Does Ukraine stand a chance in the event of a larger invasion? Will Putin suffer consequences from the international community? We're going to get answers to those questions tonight, as well as me trying to explain my best here as I can. There are some historical elements to this that you need to know, as well as what a Russian invasion of Ukraine means for us here at home in the United States. Putin also made a speech today making a bunch of false claims about Ukraine, but also essentially said that it was a historical part of Russia that illegitimately was taken away from the country and is now run by a, quote, puppet regime controlled by the United States and the West. And here's where the history part comes in. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it broke up into different regions, and Ukraine was one of them. Listen to this incredible reporting from Vox YouTube channel by journalist Sam Ellis on the matter.
Last one out of the Soviet Union, please turn out the light. The vitally important Ukraine announced
independence for the republic.
The people there are more Russian than Ukrainian.
Much to fear. Separate Ukraine would be a catastrophe.
Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century and the Soviet Union in the 20th. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, its western territory broke into independent states, including Ukraine. They formed a buffer between Russia and Western Europe. But in the 90s and 2000s, these countries started drifting westward, and many joined the EU. By invading Ukraine, Putin was able to destabilize and stop it from developing a stronger relationship with Western Europe. Russia continues to fuel the fighting by supporting the separatists and keeps its own military at the ready. Meanwhile, Ukraine's government is forced to devote resources to its defense.
Once again, just remarkable reporting from Vox video journalist Sam Ellis there on the history between these two nations. In that compilation of news reports there, you heard the reporters say things like, quote, "The people there are more Russian than Ukrainian. A separate Ukraine would be a catastrophe." In 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was essentially a referendum because there was a referendum on if Ukraine should become an independent nation. There was an overwhelming vote, Ukraine becoming an independent nation. And that was a huge concern for the Soviet Union because looking at this, they were essentially, well, Russia at this point, they were looking at Ukraine as a major part of Russia's economy, essentially described as essentially the breadbasket there for Russia. So these two nations are really close in history and also in ties, but Ukraine does not want to be a part of Russia again. And for decades, they have been moving more and more west. Yes, there have been bumps in the road, like the poisoning of an opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, when he ran for president of Ukraine in 2004. To many, he appeared to be very handsome, intelligent, and charismatic. It was him in July of 2004. 6 months later, he looked way different. In December, it was the exact same person, but he was practically not seen as the same guy. And what happened in that 6-month period, what happened while he was running for president of Ukraine as this pro-democracy candidate, was that he got poisoned with dioxin. It disfigured his face and left him with severe innervating pain. And according to doctors, the poison was found in his soup. The president of Ukraine at the time was the all-powerful Viktor Yanukovych. He was the pro-Putin installed Ukrainian dictator of the country at the time, and Russia has denied ever poisoning Mr. Yushchenko, but he ultimately did win the presidency. So yes, Ukraine has taken hits along the way, along their journey to become a Western-facing nation integrated with NATO. They are still committed to that very idea, but Russia keeps interfering, basically saying, hey, we're not okay with this, denying them that very right. And Russia's opinion here, of course, is irrelevant, but they keep claiming otherwise. After the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, Russia was punished by the international community with sanctions, and new programs were established as a unifying condemnation of what had just happened. Nevertheless, tensions between the two countries have remained, and today Putin took action. Immediately after addressing the Russian people, Ukrainian President Zelensky called President Biden in a call that to the White House says that lasted for 35 minutes. On top of that, President Zelensky also soon spoke with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The statements of reject and actions such as sanctions have now begun. President Joe Biden today vehemently denouncing these actions by Russia and signing an executive order prohibiting U.S. investment and trade in the two specific separatist-controlled regions in eastern Ukraine, allowing the Biden administration to sanction anyone who operates in those areas. New sanctions will reportedly be announced tomorrow by the administration. The European Union condemned in the strongest possible terms Putin's recognition of those two regions in Ukraine today, saying, quote, "This step is a blatant violation of international law as well as of the Minsk agreements to which Russia is a party." End quote. A plethora of foreign leaders have also put out statements in condemning Russia and warning of coming sanctions as well. China right now is calling for their personnel in the Chinese embassy in Ukraine to essentially avoid those two separatist areas and also to stock up on essentials like food and water. The United Nations Security Council is convening right now for an urgent meeting following requests from the United States, Ukraine, and several other countries, according to Axios' reporting. And here are some questions on this front. Does this, well, of course, I was going to ask, because as I was writing this script, that was essentially, never mind. So there was a summit that was planned for President Biden and Vladimir Putin. That essentially now the White House has thrown cold water on that, saying essentially that that's probably not going to happen now, given that Russia has just invaded Ukraine. Will the sanctions deter Putin? Will the upcoming sanctions, not just from the United States, but from other foreign leaders in NATO and in the EU, will those deter Putin? Or does he feel emboldened enough to just ride those sanctions out? These are all live questions that many are wanting answers to right now. Russia keeps provoking Ukraine, recently blaming an explosion of a Russian border guard post on them. Ukraine's defense minister denies this, saying it's a, quote, outright provocation. New reporting today states that U.S. officials have discussed the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky leaving the capital if Russia attacks. According to NBC News, he would relocate to Lviv in western Ukraine, which is about 50 miles from the Polish border. I should note that right now, U.S. military personnel are already stationed in Poland right now. Poland is our ally. The idea of running a government in exile has been introduced, basically meaning Zelensky running Ukraine from overseas, not physically being in the country if an invasion were to occur. And Lviv is still in Ukraine, it's just to the far west. Russia is beginning the invasion. Russia has begun the invasion of Ukraine today by entering the east of Ukraine after declaring those two separatist regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, essentially independent. A spokesperson for Zelensky said that this relocation plan has not been talked about yet between him and President Biden. John Herbst, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, said Kiev has taken steps to ensure the government will be able to operate without disruption if there is an attack, telling NBC News, quote, "My understanding is they've made contingency plans for a continuance of government." Democratic Congressman Ted Louie just said on CNN today that Putin's goal and intent is to take over all of Ukraine. He said, quote, "If Putin merely sends forces into the existing regions in Donbass where the Russian-backed separatists already control those regions, that will be different. That if he sent his forces into the regions in which the Ukrainian forces currently control, that could be very bad." End quote. A Russian invasion of Ukraine will be met with fierce resistance. Russia has the ability to create one of the biggest global conflagrations since the Cold War, or even before that, since World War II. I mean, some of the things that we're seeing right now, some of the things that Russia is talking about is not only authoritarian, but also echoes history. In the Holocaust, after invading countries, Hitler rounded up Jews and they were sent off to concentration camps. Many escaped, but ultimately 6 million were murdered in horrifying, grim, pernicious, heartbreaking deaths that are still remembered to this day. Gas chambers. Putin is now planning essentially to do the same thing, to do something similar with rounding up specific Ukrainians to be murdered and sent off to camps. The United States warning the United Nations, warning the world that Russia has a kill list. They have credible intelligence on that front. President Zelensky of Ukraine has just addressed the nation. It is around 3 a.m. there, but this address came around 2 a.m. in Ukraine. This is reporting from CNN on just some of what the president said. According to CNN, President Zelensky says, quote, "We will not give anything to anyone." Quote, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation earlier on Tuesday saying, quote, "We don't owe anything to anyone and we will not give anything to anyone," following Russia's recent actions. On Monday, President Vladimir Putin ordered what he called a peacekeeping troops into two pro-Moscow regions of eastern Ukraine after recognizing their independence. President Zelensky said today, quote, "We are on our land. We are not afraid of anything and anyone. We don't owe anything to anyone, and we will not give away anything to anyone. And we are confident of this," Zelensky said in his video address, adding said the move was a violation of Ukraine's national integrity and their sovereignty. To Ukrainian citizens, he said Ukraine would deal with the crisis calmly and confidently, and he thanked the entire nation for their cool-headed reaction to the latest developments. He assured citizens there was no reason for a sleepless night. Zelensky reiterated that Ukraine wanted peace, though had been prepared for a Russian act of aggression for a long time. So that's just the latest on that front. Once again, the president of Ukraine addressing the nation, President Zelensky addressing the nation there in a defiant tone after President Putin today essentially talked to the Russian people, addressing them about taking back Ukraine. That it was never really an independent nation. It's always been a part of Russia. And This will not just affect Ukrainians, but everyone around the world should be concerned about this as it has major implications. Yesterday, I reported that the Department of Homeland Security and FBI warned of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure here in the United States. In addition to that, gas prices could also rise here in the United States. Today, there's local reporting from Georgia News on that front. This was reporting from NBC News Today's show, just 2 days ago on that possibility as well.
And it feels very far away right now, but the president this week warned that there could be real impacts back at home for Americans. Russia, obviously one of the world's biggest exporters of oil and gas, even though the U.S. relies on it for very little right now. What is the potential ripple effect for Americans here?
You put your finger on it, Peter. Russia puts 11 million barrels of oil on the market every day, so gas prices could spike. There could be global supply chain disruptions. We all know the story of inflation. But I think the broader picture is the Biden administration is making clear that if that happens, it's clearly Russia's fault.
Once again, that was reporting from the NBC News Today show. Now, I told you we've been following reports right now on the Russia-Ukrainian situation, on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And we have new reporting right now that indicates that the United States has urged Ukrainian President Zelensky to head to Lviv for his safety, as Russia has just invaded Ukraine. And we should be describing this as an invasion. I will say this because essentially I think what the world has been expecting for with Russia and all these theatrics that they have been up to and everything, with the tanks and everything and all this buildup with U.S. intelligence and Western forces talking about what Russia's planning to do. What Russia did today may not be as huge. It may be incremental, but this still was an invasion of Ukraine today, as they have just invaded the eastern part, even though those separatist regions, that's still part of Ukraine. We've also been following what's happening at the United Nations right now, and as I told you, the United Nations Security Council having an emergency meeting today. India has just called for constructive diplomacy and restraint at this emergency UN meeting, saying, quote, "The escalation of tensions along the border of Ukraine with the Russian Federation is a matter of deep concern. These developments have the potential to undermine peace and security of the region. We strongly emphasize the vital need for all sides to maintain international peace and security by exercising the utmost restraint and intensifying diplomatic efforts to ensure that a mutually amicable solution is arrived at the earliest." Japan, in addition to that, has just condemned Russia's recognition of pro-Moscow regions in Ukraine, saying, quote, "Our country will monitor the situation with grave concern and coordinate with the G7 international community on strict responses, which includes sanctions." And we have new reports that the United Kingdom will announce new sanctions against Russia, saying, quote, "There will be severe economic consequences to its actions." The Council must be united in calling for Russia to de-escalate immediately in condemning aggression against a sovereign nation and defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia has brought us to the brink. We urge Russia to step back. The United States Secretary of State Blinken has not yet canceled his meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Now, I was going to raise this question in the show here on, since there has been an invasion of Ukraine today, and in the eastern part, since there has been an invasion of Ukraine, does that slam the door shut on diplomacy? Apparently not. According to CNN, quote, "U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has not canceled his meeting on Thursday with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov as of Monday evening." Two U.S. State Department officials told CNN, although top officials have been discussing that decision throughout the day. Biden administration officials said they are going to watch what Russia does closely overnight and prepare a significant response on Tuesday. Part of the response could include a decision about the meeting in Geneva, because the U.S. has already said that it will not happen if Russia further invades Ukraine. So, as of tonight, right now, Russia has invaded the nation of Ukraine. This is a smaller invasion of the nation of Ukraine, but they have invaded the country. Now, that does not rule out the possibility that Russia could further invade Ukraine on a larger scale. And now that they have invaded this nation, What should we expect next? And what does Putin even want in Ukraine? Those are live questions that have been answered, and we've got those for you tonight. Stay with us on this TJPS special report.